Thanks, everybody. I would also like to pay my respects to the Wiradjuri and the Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of Naarm, where we stand today, to their elders past, present and emerging, and the elders of other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who may be here today or who may be watching the video of the talk. As Chris said, I'm a professor of design at 2 Scandinavian universities. I'm a descendant of settlers in Australia, and I'm a settler in both Sweden and Denmark. I would like to acknowledge the Sámi peoples, the traditional custodians of Ubmeje Sápmi, the unceded land where I live and work in Sweden, and the Brinja Yuin peoples of Yuin country here in Australia, where my family is situated and with whom I am nurturing collaborations. Today I'll speak to the emerging research of the Sympoietic Collaboratory, or we call it SPC, and FoodLab, and I'll make a case for why research at the margins matters. So my research is about food practices, cultures and imaginaries, leveraging food for its vibrant materiality, its aesthetic, socio-cultural, personal, political, multi-species and environmental power. Increasingly, my research is also concerned with high-level sustainability advice assembled by experts to try to make clear the state of play, the urgency of our planetary situation and possible ways forward, and how this advice intersects with situated practice and policy making. In my 2 research groups, we engage across scales, leading situated multi-actor inquiries into more than human flourishing, focusing on food, health and microbiomes, bodies, communities and cities, and the interplays between situated, territorial, regional and planetary concerns, working across disciplinary boundaries using a post-disciplinary approach. In the research, we use food as a material to think with through embodied inquiry, asking questions such as what will we eat when everything has changed? How might exploring our bonds with wild landscapes help us find new answers to this question? Can we cook, eat, forage towards other possibilities? How do we imagine new ways of eating if changing how we eat means changing who we are? Eating is necessary for survival. It's critical to cultural identity. It embodies political power, shapes landscapes and habitats. Alongside breathing air and drinking water, eating food is the most intimate way we interact with the natural world, and it shapes and is shaped by our changing planet. 70% of the food consumed across the world is grown, raised, fished, hunted and foraged by smallholder and peasant farmers and indigenous peoples. However, industrial food is rapidly replacing traditional foodways everywhere, bringing lifestyle diseases and accelerating climate change and biodiversity loss. Roughly 1/3 of all carbon emissions globally are tied to food production, distribution, consumption and waste. Yet less than 1/4 of the food produced industrially actually reaches people. The rest is wasted in production inefficiencies, lost in transport, storage and household practices, or is diverted to non-food products. In March 2022, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, told us that the only way to stay under 1.5 degrees below pre-industrial levels is to transform our food system. Sadly, that ship has actually sailed. Today, we face war, biodiversity collapse, species extinctions, social unrest and extreme weather due to climate change. But while the 1.5 degree ship may have sailed, coherent and effective food system transformation can still help us address climate chaos, biodiversity and ecosystem collapse, energy overuse, resource depletion, social inequalities, and more. Our research in SPC and FoodLab supports people and others to negotiate what effective and coherent food system transformation looks like where they live, eat, produce, and source their food. We make food data digestible by bringing it to the scale of the body, using food as an icebreaker, a prompt for new thinking, and as sustenance. Through casual engagement with food as data, the data literally becomes food for thought, and this is some work developed within the Data Cuisine project by Susan Yashko, and I'm going to forget Maurice's last name, and I do apologize for that. But if you look up Data Cuisine, net, you can find out all the information about that, but they exemplify these ideas that I'm bringing forward very nicely. So by engaging people's senses, food can become a richly loaded prompt for discussion. Making data and edible sculpture opens space for meaning making and reflection, making it a ticket to talk. When experimenting with food as a biodesign material, and this comes back to the work coming out of my labs and teaching, the properties and interactions with the food can serve as inspiration for storytelling and representation. Food practices are situated in the body, the community, local, sociocultural, environmental, and political ecosystems, yet their impacts and reach are global. Human food systems connect with all 17 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and its industrial forms pressures all 9 of the planetary boundaries that we must stay within if we hope to have a livable future. In FoodLab and SPC, we ask who decides what a livable future looks like, and is livable enough? Don't we want to flourish together with the species that First Peoples have been stewarding for tens of thousands of years? So our research invites people with different ways of thinking and living to come together to consider what flourishing might look like and how we might get there. And this work is increasingly led by First Peoples elders. We work across scales, trying to understand what people and communities need to become agents of change, to move from being responsible citizens who, for example, recycle, and participatory citizens who demand recycling stations are available where needed, to become environmental citizens, able to act in their communities and cities with systemic impact and responsibility, guiding the laws that are made that shape and constrain our practices, active in societal transformation and stewardship of nature, helping to ensure, for example, that recycling isn't needed. We work across disciplines, trying to make connections between planetary knowledges and situated experiences, to clear the fog from the space in between these different scales and ways of knowing. Växtvägg, which means plant wall, for example, brings together design, molecular biology, and forestry to rethink what a vertical garden in the Arctic could be. When the old plant wall on the arts campus in Umeå died, we analysed the leaf and soil microbiomes and discovered that the plants were keeping away human pathogens. So instead of using tropical plants to make the new wall, we brought the boreal forest indoors and incorporated food and aromatics. We placed mycelium panels close to saplings, and rather than bake off the mycelium to stop it from growing, we let it grow. And we followed what happened on a molecular level to see how the panels might be optimized to provide benefits to the plants, the trees, and the soil. So this work combines the scales of the microbiome, the forest, and the building interior to think in new ways about cohabitation with plants and living ecosystems. And most of the work was realized we had 2 undergraduate theses in molecular biology, and the student climate group at Umeå Institute of Design, where I'm based, did all of the other work. At the scale of the body, I co-lead a binational clinical study that aims to understand how to get people to eat carrots every day, to reduce the regrowth of cancerous polyps. Colorectal cancer is one of the leading causes of cancer-related death in the world. In Sweden, people drink carrot juice, but in Denmark, they don't, and they find it really weird, the idea that someone could drink carrot juice. And yet, the preliminary research demonstrates that if you drink a certain amount of this carrot juice every day, you can prevent the regrowth of cancerous polyps or seriously reduce them. So my team, which cuts across design, molecular biology, food sciences, and culinary arts, works with patients in both countries to uncover what they need to change how they eat. We all know that change is difficult, even when your life depends upon it. So we use embodied and poetic means in a clinical setting to upend the assumptions that people have about patient engagement. Also at the scale of the body as holobiont or host for a multi-species assemblage. In the SHIT project, we invite people with chronic gut diseases to connect with their gut microbiome by painting, building, performing their guts, modeling their feces with food. This work has powerful sociocultural impact and is changing the lived experience of people who are not well served by medicine or technology. And it does it by bringing the microbiome to the scale of the body in support of more than human health. So we're now working with patient organizations in Denmark and Sweden to co-create kits of activities that reimagine self-directed care as a form of embodied and poetic activism. At the scale of the community and the city, I'm local coordinator and work package lead of a European project that works with 12 cities across Europe, Turkey, and the Ukraine, helping these cities to work out how to transform their food systems to be more sustainable so that other cities in Europe can learn from our efforts. We use a food living lab methodology to conduct at-scale in-situ experiments to work out how to accelerate sustainable and meaningful change. My team in Denmark works closely with the municipality in Kolding and the people, business, and organizations across the city to support the development of environmental citizenship throughout the food value chain, recognizing that while in Fusilli we work with a clear value chain of production and processing, distribution, consumption, waste, and governance, but recognizing that actually it's a complex web of interdependencies and relationships. And so our work makes interventions into policy and practice. And we also work closely with all 12 cities, helping them to envision and develop their living labs and work with dynamic learning questions. At the scale of the region and the planet, I sit on numerous working groups and steering committees, contribute directly to the development of EU policy, and engage with authors of key sustainability reports, trying to understand what can better facilitate productive exchange from the planetary scale to personal situated experience. And my institutions support this work. At SDU, we have a lead author on the IPCC reports. The Mayor Research Group, which I sit within, set up and maintains the Danish IPBES Secretariat, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And the former dean of my faculty is the chair of the Danish Climate Council, which provides oversight on how our government is doing in its international commitments. At Umeå, Maria Nilsson is chair of the Lancet Countdown, a transdisciplinary research collaboration for monitoring progress on health and climate change at the EU level and globally. Camilla Sandström is UNESCO chair of Living Labs in the Arctic, and I'm about to take up an Arctic 5 University's chairship in Arctic food citizenship. Umeå University sits on the Arctic Scientific Committee for Research and Planning, and we just signed a 10-year contract to host the EU Polar Board and EU PolarNet at Umeå University in our Arctic Centre. And these organisations together form the EU Polar Coordination Office, and this gives us direct access to the key policy mechanisms for Arctic matters. People experience the world at the scale of the body, the community, and the city. Rarely more than that, really. Sustainability reports and high-level intergovernmental advice engages at the scale of the region and the planet. And these reports provide important data that's often difficult for non-experts to translate to local conditions. And critical goals such as eliminating hunger that are clearly worthy but lack specificity for people to enact or interpret to their situated conditions. And there's a critical gap here that my research aims to speak into. Through various projects and means, I'm interested in working out how we can bring these perspectives, which grow out of radically different ways of knowing, being, and doing, into something new. New forms of citizenship that are situated and embodied, that upstream lived knowledges into planetary change-making more effectively than is done so at present, and in ways that are sufficiently pluriversal that they can work across scales, cultures, and imaginaries to bring about meaningful change. First peoples have foregrounded embodied knowledges around the world for millennia, stewarding planetary ecosystems, ensuring healthy, good food and ecologies into the future. In contrast to this embodied and situated approach, high-level expert reports are built using rational means, expert meetings and workshops, reviews of scientific literature examining the data. This is a mapping of the number of scientific articles drawn on to develop the IPCC assessment reports. The first report drew on 1,697 papers listed on the Web of Science to demonstrate the challenge of climate change and provide critical policy advice. The sixth report, released in March last year, draws on around 300,000 scientific articles about climate change. The red numbers map the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is a key indicator of climate change. Looking at this, I think we can agree that more data is not actually the answer. Further, because the reports are often generalised to be relevant to everyone, they're arguably relevant to no one. It's virtually impossible to understand or interpret them at the local level, where people are dealing with ongoing cycles of snow and ice, flooding, hurricanes, fires, wars, forced migration, ecosystem collapse, and more. And yet these reports are shaping the policies that determine how we can act. They provide critical advice for transforming our economies, which has value, but leave out the cultural and spiritual work that needs to be done. We need to transform the cultures and values that underpin the way majority people are acting. This is not a behaviour change issue, it's a question of transforming who we are and the narratives, values and mindsets that shape how we act. We need to embody systemic change across scales, cultures and imaginaries. And the imaginaries, they're the values, institutions, laws and symbols through which people envision the scope of society and how they can act. We need new ways of imagining, because if you can't imagine that something is possible, it's very hard to do. So in contrast to the IPCC, I create workshops that are messy, that hold people in the moment to enable them to think in other ways, entangled with their situated surroundings, fecund with odours, dirt, creatures, critters, and uncertainty. These embodied methods matter. It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots, not knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. I want to bring you now to a community in change. My mother lives in Cobargo, New South Wales, the town that was worst hit by the Black Summer fires. The land in Cobargo was cultivated for thousands of years by First Nations Australians, using fire practices to ensure rich and plentiful food sources until the colonisers, my ancestors, put a stop to it. Food practices changed, the landscape changed very, very quickly, and now it's a tinderbox just waiting to catch a light. So as we think about divergences across scales, cultures and imaginaries, we might consider the collisions between my mum and her friends and local food laws. For some years now, my mum and her partner Tammy, and this is Tammy's mum, have enjoyed shared ownership of several cows called Hamburger and Sausage and minced meat or ribs. And these cows have been lovingly raised on the farm 2 doors down. The cows are slaughtered on the farm, and that's when it gets tricky. From the moment the cow is dead and becomes meat in the eyes of the law, it can't legally leave that farm for the short walk to Mum and Tammy's freezer. So they have no choice but to break the law if they want to hold to their values. In another example, faced with too much uneven produce for a single household of people, dogs, chickens and goats, my mum started a food swap. At first it was at her place every month, but now it moves from house to house around the farms and villages in the area. For the record, that's my mum. People arrive at the food swap with their excess produce, pop their goodies on the produce table, then help themselves to tea, coffee, cakes and have a chat, see old friends, make some new ones. And when it's time to leave, they take something from the produce table on their way out. No one looks or counts, people come and go. The feeling of community is strong and always nurtured. But when someone brings jam or makes pie or in some other way produces food, it can become problematic, because our bodies can't interfere with produce in Australia without it coming under other legislations created to protect people from poor practices that unfold at other scales. Legislations that aim to prevent the feel of your hand from touching dough, for example, and then passing on your cultures to others in more ways than one. The ways we eat can connect us to country and to each other, can heal the earth and ourselves in the process, but this is not guaranteed. I know my mother has always found solace in gardening, for example, but the 3 years that it took to clean up their land, to remove the dead birds that suffocated while flying, the dead trees, hundreds of mature trees desiccated, swathes of land that my forestry colleagues assure me will regrow, but when I see that land, these photos were taken more than 3 years after the last fires. When I see that land, my heart clutches in my throat, and I wonder how the seeds will come back where there's no food for the animals or birds to come with their seed-filled poo. So when the reports say reduce hunger, everyone nods in agreement. Of course we want to reduce hunger, but telling us to do things and leaving the work of translation to who knows who will not help us to get things done. Governments and local councils struggle to provide frameworks to support coherent and effective action. Because high-level advice and policies and laws need to be generalized, they diverge from the lived realities and perceptions of individuals who are enmeshed in local foodways. The result is a conundrum of disparities rooted in contrasting views of our existences and interactions with the world. So I'll speak a little bit now about some of the work that we're doing in response to this. In Rethinking Food, we provided 35 multi-generational households with locally purchased foods, which, according to the Future 50 food reports, are healthy for people and planet. Over 3 months, the families cooked and ate and argued their way through the food to understand how to eat more sustainably, and they got a little bit angry as well. They accused us of being sloppy researchers because we didn't translate the report, but it only came in English. They wanted to know why they had to use Japanese mushrooms, not those that they can forage nearby. And they rightfully asked, how could fresh lotus root flown in from Thailand be healthy for people and planet? And we sourced 46 of the 50 foods locally without placing any orders. They shared recipes and ideas in a closed Facebook group, joined online cooking classes, and came to distanced markets during COVID to re-up their supplies. All the families received the recipes for the cooking classes, but only those who joined the classes actually cooked in community ended up with mung beans as a staple in their cupboard. Who knew mung beans were delicious, they exclaimed. And they said if this food, the foods that were new to them, many of them purchased at the local supermarkets, if these foods were available in their local supermarkets, they would buy them all the time. The research was framed as citizen science, so our participants felt a responsibility to contribute. And I used participatory research through design, as I always do, but we framed it in this particular case as citizen science. And it did something different in terms of the sense of responsibility or the role in the research that the participants felt they were playing. And they began to act as agents of change, not only in their homes and social circles, but in their workplaces as well, which is actually quite radical for a Dane to speak out, to stand out from the crowd, to transgress Jente law, which encourages you to blend in, to not make a fuss, to be small. They expressed feeling empowered to impact policy, though there was no engagement with local council or policy instruments. And these impacts go far beyond the scope of the project. And I hypothesized that it was the embodied engagement with the materiality of what was at stake and the community space to test out their new ideas that let them build up their confidence to take action. Across all of this work, we use food to ask deeply philosophical questions about where we humans begin and end. We don't take an instrumental approach, because lived experience is messy, weird, banal, poetic, and lovely. It defies measurement because it's relational rather than rational. New research is building on the radicality of the SHIT project to explore how embodied experience can be essential to transformative change-making, transforming who we are, how we know things, how high-level expert advice is interpreted at the local level, and how this advice is developed at the source. This work is being undertaken with a diverse range of partners, in particular with Indigenous partners in Sápmi and on Yuin country, in what Homi Bhabha calls third spaces. Third spaces are sites of negotiation and resistance that recognize that the agency and creativity of marginalized groups in shaping their identities and resisting hegemonic cultural norms. So Thirst, for example, is operationalizing third spaces, shifting them from concept to practice to support embodied encounters between First Peoples and settlers, to uncover inclusive and dynamic understandings of cultural identity in a diverse and interconnected world, and support the formation of new cultural identities and expressions that better reflect the interplay of power and difference, engaging in embodied ways with the materiality of what is at stake. And the aim is to bring Sámi and Yuin people together with each other, with elders, across generations, with local authorities, with settlers, new and old, with community members, diverse community members, multi-species communities, and to do these 4 things: to foster shared social imaginaries that traverse the divide between First People and settler ways of knowing, being, and doing, and investigating how shared social imaginaries might be developed, how they impact the present understandings of the past and potential futures, how they determine how society can function and envision how the world might be. To cultivate environmental food citizenship, examining the role of collective, situated, embodied sense-making, meaning-making, and imagining in developing social imaginaries and the capacity to act as an agent of change with systemic responsibility and impact. Contextualizing sustainability advice at the community and local level, supporting the co-creation of novel data representations, to link international advice with situated circumstances, and to offer pluriversal perspectives for integrating policy and action. Developing pathways for lived knowledges to inform sustainability transitions that encompass diverse cultures and scales of advice, policy, beliefs, and practices. Determining what is needed to scale findings up to impact policy, infrastructure, and laws, out to support adoption and adaptation of methods to new locations, and deep to impact mindsets, values, and narratives that drive action and determine what's possible across all scales of society. So this work is taking place in Vindelälven Juttataka UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in Sweden, which goes from the west to the east, from the mountains through the forest to the rivers, following the longest free-flowing river in Europe, encompassing 7 Sámi villages and 8 Swedish municipalities. And in Australia, it's happening on diverse sites on Yuin country, with elders, communities, food actors, settlers, and the Bega Valley and Eurobodalla Shire councils working at the speed of trust to strengthen the relations between our foodways and imaginaries across divergent scales, cultures, and worldviews. And this work is being developed in close collaboration with First People, elders, and knowledge holders across scales and locations, and that's really important. And this notion of working at the speed of trust is also critically important. And so that means it takes the time that it takes if we want to do this well and have the humility to learn from people who actually have extraordinary knowledges at hand that can contribute to how we are imagining the world. We being everyone, all of us. So in complement, building a rhizomatic Silk Road of food living labs from the Arctic to the Mediterranean and from Ireland to the East China Sea, identifying agroecological territories with promising business production and cooperation models, developing novel, embodied and situated evaluation and monitoring methods that can capture situated knowledges to support community flourishing, resilience and thriving in place. The work will then be scaled up to inform policy, legislations, laws and infrastructures out, within and across the living labs to support the adoption and adaptation of promising models to new locations, and deep to impact narratives, values and mindsets. Because this is what's required if we're to support transformative systems change, environmental citizenship across all scales of society. So I want to finish with some emerging examples. In Umeå, Lena, one of my PhD students, is doing research into environmental food citizenship, examining the social, economic, and more than human tensions involved in the making of culture through the practice of yogurt making. Lena is Pakistani, and her research is focused on the Indian subcontinent. In the late 1800s, when Indians were first shipped off to the UK to fill labour shortages, they not only missed their loved ones, but they also missed food, and in particular yogurt. And they sent melancholy letters back home about both. So in a beautiful act of care, their families painted airmail envelopes with yogurt and let them dry and then sent them to their loved ones in the UK so the diaspora could reconstitute the yogurt cultures that were familiar. And so Lena is looking into the more than human implications of these kinds of practices. And she was recently in Karachi and wanted to airmail a yogurt-smeared envelope back to herself in Umeå, but it turns out that today that's illegal. So she carried it in her luggage for the moment. Also in Umeå, Tash Bates is doing a postdoc in design and molecular biology. Tash is also Australian, has a background in biotechnology and contemporary arts and a PhD from Symbiotica in biological arts. So Tasha's main project in Umeå, Sensory Foraging, is a transdisciplinary exploration of the work that volatile chemicals do in environmental and climate change, food systems and disease. And many of these chemicals are produced by microbes and are exchanged at all scales from the nano to the planetary, flowing between microbes, fungi, plants, animals, soil, air and water. And so Tasha is creating a web of scent-based foraging actions oriented towards tracing the multiscalar metabolisms of odorants between and within bodies, ecosystems, and cultures to explore how they make the living and non-living sensible. The work explores the reorientations and responsibilities made possible by the joyous and riotous queer performativities of odorants. In Kolding, Nina Möller, who is about to be promoted to an associate professor, has been working with Indigenous foodways and agroecology since undertaking extended PhD fieldwork in the Ecuadorian and Peruvian Amazon. Nina has been in part of FoodLab for 2 years now, and one of the projects she's leading is a research project called Reviving Indigenous Food Systems for Crisis Resilience, rethinking rural development in one of the poorest yet most biodiverse regions on the planet. Nina's work in agroecology is well known and impactful, looking at financing and alternative financings and economic and policy issues in practice. She's been a consultant for the Food and Agricultural Organization for years, and bringing her into the team has enabled an expansion of our expertise in this direction. For years now, we've been working with Agroecology Europe, with Via Campesina, which is the global peasant farmers network that engages with smallholders, peasant landholders, and indigenous farming and food networks, and with Scola Campesina, which is the Peasant Farmer Education Initiative, thinking with extraordinary people about food, life, and futures, using design to explore these things through praxis. In our work, we have a habit of getting people to make dinners together so that they take ownership of food-based design processes. These are Green Streets Market board members at their annual general meeting, using food as a tool for thinking. So when we make tangibles, we make them out of items that can be put back into the nutrition cycle, but we also use food for all of the other meanings and potentials that it brings. And we leverage co-creation and commensality as integral to the work. So we do this to develop people's capacities to be agents of change. And we designed a dinner that we had hot pots with a kind of fireside space where people could come from their tables to the hot pots, but the food that they could have in the hot pots was mostly on their tables, so they could have small and focused conversations and then speak intergroup and together in new ways when they're at the hot pot. So using the familiar and fundamental acts around food and eating to generate new kinds of relations and conversations. This is a pilot experiment that we did in Umeå, a workshop where we brought together fishers, chefs, designers, and public authorities to recenter the lived experience of the fishers in public policy process. We had a couple of groups, and in the group I was in, we focused on the problem of grey seals, whose population has been growing 5% every year since the 2000s in the Bothnian Sea, the part of the Baltic Sea that is in the Arctic area near Umeå. And because of the way that Sweden interprets a piece of EU legislation, the Bothnian Sea is now overrun with seals. The entire ecosystem is out of whack, and the seals are eating just about everything that the fishers catch in their nets. So our fisher told us that from 123 nets put out in 2018, 116 came back empty and damaged. He said he feels like his job has become preparing smorgasbords for the seals. It's completely unsustainable. Whereas the fishers see their work as sustaining the ecosystem, as gathering food, but as part of maintaining ecosystem balance. And the legislation that they don't prevent the culling or the killing of seals, but the only people who can use the resultant bodies as resources are Inuit people, and there are no Inuit people in this part of the world. There are Inuits in Greenland. So what it means is that you have to stop doing the things that sustain your livelihood if you're going to hunt seals. And hunting seals is not an easy thing. It's quite a skilled and difficult and time-consuming thing. So for the fishers to do it, they need to stop fishing to go and hunt seals, and then they have no time for fishing, but they have no fish to fish anyway. And the way Sweden interprets the law means that that's just the way that it is. The way Finland interprets the law is a little bit different. For example, if you hunt a seal, you are paid 200 euro by the Finnish government, and if you bury the seal, then you are paid another 200 euros. So then the fishers on the Finnish side of the Bothnian Sea can actually work together to try to maintain ecosystem balance. But of course, the sea knows no borders, and the whole ecosystem is out of whack. So it surprised me when the fisher that we were working with wanted to talk to the Swedish government rather than the EU policy mechanisms that I work with directly. And he said, no, if we do something in Sweden, we can be more effective. And it's not to challenge the knowledge that is behind the development of this law, but to challenge how it engages with the traditional knowledges that are here. In Australia, we would say on country, that are here in Sápmi. So we invited Susanna Jönsson to join us, and Susanna is a Sámi chef expert in seal meat, and amongst many other things. And she worked with Björn, who runs the food school at Umeå University, to give tuna the texture and taste of seal, preparing it in a particular way with beef blood. And we looked up the fat composition of seal milk, which is 50%, much higher than cow's milk. And so we enriched cow cream with coconut lard to give it the right taste and mouthfeel. And we served the mock seal meat dish, which, as it was eaten, made way for more fish to be served. And this was followed by the mock seal ice cream, which was served with a cloudberry sauce that has a sourness. And the chefs explained that sourness aims to bring you present to the seal pups that die for you to enjoy the dessert. Needless to say, both dishes served as a ticket to talk. The proposal now is that we serve this meal or an elaboration of the idea at Västerbottens veckorna in Stockholm next year. This is an annual gathering that brings together Sweden's decision makers to enjoy the cultural bounty of the North. And the dinner is attended by the Prime Minister, policy makers, everyone basically who decides how EU laws are responded to at the national level. Both public authorities that we worked with here, we worked with Umeå Municipality and Region Västerbotten, that's the county that Umeå is within and that encompasses Vindelälven Jutataka Biosphere Reserve. They were thrilled with the process. They said that they've been coming together for years, but this is the first time that they really heard each other and understood what is at play. And the intention now is to use these methods of cooking and eating and designing meals that together that not just capture data in a dish that stands still, but acknowledge the unfolding process and performativity of a dinner that's served, that's enjoyed, that has courses, that unfolds over time and unfolds in relation. And using those aspects of the dinner, leveraging those to make data meals that can enliven and deepen discussions around the lived experience. Because what we have, at the moment, we have a whole lot of scientists gathering data about the lived experience. This data is then used to develop intergovernmental advice, and that advice shapes policy that is interpreted at the local level and then applied to lived experience. And there's an enormous cavern between the local interpretation of policy and the lived experience, because that loop just creates a distance that has seemed unbreachable. But through the methods that we're using, we're finding that at least they're showing promise of seeding radical change. nationally, we hope here in this case, so that we can bring our ecosystem back into balance. But we're doing this work at the EU level as well, and nationally in Denmark, and at different levels in different places. Through Fusili, we're working, as I said, in 11 countries across 12 cities, including Turkey and the Ukraine. And in all of these places, we're looking at the interrelation between practice and lived knowledges and the pluriversality of lived experience, and how that can better be brought into dialogue with the policy processes. So I called this talk at the beginning, Growing Collaborative Futures, Why Research at the Margins Matters. And I haven't spoken explicitly about margins, but I hope you can see how the notion of working at epistemic, ontological, cultural, geographic, and methodological margins is at the core of our work in FoodLab and the Sympoietic Collaboratory, or what I cheekily call SPC. And every time I say it, I think of the jingle that I heard as a child by the Shepparton Packaging Company. We need new ontologies. We need these to achieve the kinds of transformation that will support just futures in which humans and non-humans can flourish in all of our diversity and pluriversality, across situated and systemic understandings of the world, with the aim of not only making visible the situated role and impact of policies on practices, the one rational, the other cultural, spiritual, embodied, empirical, but co-creating the circumstances so that the boundaries between these might become more porous, in the way that Stacey Alaimo conceptualizes the porousness of the body with the rest of the world. Our gastrointestinal tracts are not just a tube that the world passes through. They're a continual space of entanglement that can be leveraged to empower people at all scales to work together and develop our abilities to act as agents of change with societal responsibility and impact. Whether we're developing sustainability advice, producing food, or just trying to put it on the table, all of our perspectives must count. Food is citizenship. Every living thing on the planet eats. Food is our most intimate and regular connection with each other and with the rest of nature, so I believe holds the key with embodiment and co-creation in community to what we need to be doing in and beyond food-based concerns. Thank you.